October 3rd, 1973, 2:14 in the afternoon. Meridian Records and Rare Collectibles, West 48th Street, Manhattan, New York. The street outside was loud with taxis and construction noise, but inside this shop, the world moved differently. The air smelled of old vinyl, cedar shelving, and something close to money. The kind of quiet that only expensive things produce hung over every surface. Framed posters behind glass, signed photographs sealed in archival sleeves, display cases lit from below, each piece resting like a relic in a private museum. Raymond Caldwell sat behind a mahogany counter at the back of the room, reading glasses balanced at the end of his nose, both hands flat on an open ledger. He was assessing the day's appointments. A Chicago producer arriving at 4, a museum curator from Boston the following morning. Serious buyers, his kind of people. He did not look up when the door chime rang. He looked up when the footsteps stopped moving. The man who had walked in was standing just inside the door, very still. Slim, quiet. A plain brown corduroy jacket, dark trousers, leather shoes worn soft at the heel. Long, dark hair falling past his collar. Round, wire-rimmed glasses. No urgency in his face. No performance. He was simply standing there, looking toward the back wall of the shop with an expression that Raymond Caldwell could not immediately classify. In 18 years of business, Ray had built an almost perfect system for reading customers in the first 30 seconds. He knew a serious collector by the way they moved, deliberate, focused, slightly reverent. He knew a time waster by their wandering eyes. This man's eyes were not wandering. They were completely still, locked on something behind the counter, and the expression on his face was not excitement or curiosity. It was recognition. Ray followed the man's gaze to the oak-framed piece mounted on the back wall. Then he looked back at the stranger. "Can I help you with something?" The man did not answer immediately. He took 3 slow steps forward. Then, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Where did you get that?" Subscribe to this channel, because what happened next in this shop on a cold October afternoon is one of the most extraordinary stories in rock history. And it begins with a man who had no idea who was standing in front of him. That question, 4 words, spoken barely above a whisper, meant nothing to Raymond Caldwell in that moment. He heard it the way a man hears background noise. He filed it away and moved on. But to understand why those 4 words would eventually dismantle everything Ray believed about his business, his instincts, and himself, you have to go back. You have to understand who Raymond Caldwell was, and more importantly, you have to understand who the quiet man in the corduroy jacket truly was. Raymond Caldwell opened Meridian Records in 1955 as an ordinary record shop on a busy midtown block. For the first decade, he sold singles and LPs to working people, secretaries, cab drivers, college students who saved their lunch money for a new pressing. Then 1964 arrived, and with it, something that changed the mathematics of music forever. Beatlemania did not just transform radio, it transformed value. Ray watched teenagers pay 50 cents for a record and understood, with the cold clarity of a businessman, that in 20 years, those same records would be worth 50 times as much. He began acquiring original pressings, signed concert programs, handwritten set lists pulled from trash bins after shows at the Fillmore and Madison Square Garden. He authenticated everything through Christie's. He insured everything through Lloyd's of London. By 1970, Meridian was no longer a record shop. It was a vault with a door that opened for the right kind of people. Ray dressed accordingly. He expected the same from his customers. 3 times over the years, he had guided browsers, politely but firmly, toward the exit when their presentation did not meet his invisible standard. He did not consider this cruelty. He considered it curation. The man in the corduroy jacket was 30 years old. His name was George Harrison. 18 months earlier, he had staged the concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Garden, the first major humanitarian benefit concert in rock history, an event that changed what musicians believed they were capable of doing with their platform. His solo album, All Things Must Pass, had sold millions of copies across 6 continents. He had spent the previous months in India with Ravi Shankar. He had flown into New York 3 days ago for a production meeting, and found himself with a free afternoon. George Harrison always did the same thing with free afternoons in unfamiliar cities. He went looking for old records. Not his own, other people's. He had not expected to find something of his own instead. George moved slowly through the shop, the way a man moves when he is not shopping but remembering. He passed the first display case without stopping. Framed concert posters, signed photographs, promotional acetates sealed behind museum glass. He registered all of it with the quiet attention of someone fluent in this language. He stopped at the second case, pressed close to the glass, looked at a 1965 original UK pressing of Rubber Soul resting on a velvet stand, priced at $4,200 on a small ivory card. He straightened up and continued toward the back of the shop. This is when Raymond Caldwell moved. Ray rose from his stool with the practiced smoothness of a man who had performed this particular maneuver many times. He came around the counter and positioned himself between George and the back wall. Not aggressively, not obviously, but with the precise body language of a gatekeeper who has never once questioned his right to keep the gate. He gestured broadly at the opposite end of the room. "Most of what you'll find interesting is probably over here," he said, his voice warm and professional and completely condescending. Original pressings from the late 50s, early 60s, some wonderful material, very collectible. The pieces in that section were priced between $150 and $400. Ray had guided a dozen men who looked like this toward that corner. None of them had ever complained. George did not follow the gesture. He looked at Ray for a moment, then looked past him toward the oak-framed piece mounted on the back wall. A single handwritten page, musical notation and partial lyrics, mounted on cream backing board behind non-reflective glass. "That piece on the wall," George said quietly. "The handwritten sheet. What can you tell me about it?" Ray turned, glanced at it, and turned back. He removed his reading glasses and cleaned them with his pocket square, a small performance of deliberation. "That," he said, replacing the glasses, "is one of our most significant holdings. Original handwritten musical notation, partial lyric content, authenticated through Christie's in 1971. Full chain of provenance documentation. We acquired it from a private collector in London." He paused just long enough to make the next part land cleanly. "The asking price is $35,000. It reflects the rarity of the piece and the authentication costs involved." He smiled. The smile said, "Which is why I'm going to suggest you look at something else." George nodded slowly. He said nothing. Behind a small wooden desk buried under record sleeves and shipping invoices, a young woman named Claire Donovan had stopped working. She was 24 years old, a Berkeley College dropout, who had taken the job because it kept her inside music, even when music wouldn't let her in the front door. She had stopped the moment the man in the corduroy jacket walked in. She had not picked up a single sleeve since. She was watching his hands, the way they stayed still at his sides, the way his eyes moved across that framed page on the wall. Not the way a buyer reads a price tag, but the way a person reads their own handwriting. Ray, growing impatient now, tried once more. "Sir, I want to be respectful of your time. This particular section of the shop is really designed for serious institutional collectors. Perhaps." George turned and looked at him directly for the first time. "I wrote that page." Claire Donovan put down the record sleeve she wasn't holding and went completely still. "If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere that was built from something you created, stay with this story." Because what George Harrison did next had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong. It had everything to do with something far more important than that. Hit subscribe and don't go anywhere. Raymond Caldwell did not go pale. He did not freeze. It was not a cruel laugh. It was something more insulting than cruelty. It was the laugh of a man who considered himself too experienced to be surprised, too professional to be caught off guard, too seasoned in this business to take seriously a claim made by a stranger in a worn corduroy jacket standing on the wrong side of his display cases. "Sir," he said, the warmth in his voice thinning just slightly. "I've been in this business for 18 years. I've had gentlemen tell me they played cards with Elvis Presley. I've had a woman tell me she helped Buddy Holly write Peggy Sue in a diner in Lubbock, Texas." He folded his hands on the counter. "Everyone who walks through that door has a story. It's part of the charm of the business. But this piece has a complete authentication trail. Christie's provenance documentation. A verified chain of ownership going back to 1969. I assure you, no one is going to walk in off the street and—" He stopped. Claire Donovan was no longer behind her desk. She had crossed the shop floor quietly, the way a person moves when they have made a decision they know is irreversible. She was carrying something, a record album, its cover facing upward, held flat in both hands like something she was presenting rather than simply carrying. She placed it on the mahogany counter between the two men without a word. She did not look at Ray. She looked at George. It was a copy of All Things Must Pass. The back cover photograph showed 4 separate portraits, arranged in a grid. Paul McCartney, John Lennon, Ringo Starr, and in the bottom right corner, dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses, the same quiet eyes that were looking at Ray Caldwell across the counter right now, George Harrison. Ray put his reading glasses on. He looked at the photograph. He looked up at the man standing in front of him. He looked at the photograph again. The process took approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the expression on Raymond Caldwell's face moved through confusion, doubt, the specific vertigo of a man whose internal architecture is shifting without warning, and then something that landed well past embarrassment, a clean, silent horror that comes only when a person understands that they have been wrong in a way that cannot be reframed or softened or explained away. George Harrison did not enjoy this moment. That was what nobody in the room expected. There was no satisfaction in his face, no quiet pleasure in the reversal, none of the vindication that the situation seemed designed to deliver. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a small folded rectangle of paper, a hotel receipt, soft at the creases, kept from habit rather than intention. He placed it on the counter beside the album cover. "I was in Paris in 1968, working on material that became something else later. I wrote that page in the hotel and understood by the time I finished it that the song didn't need it. The thinking was already done." He paused. "I gave it to a roadie named Tommy Walsh, who'd mentioned he wanted to write music. I told him to start there." He looked at the framed page on the wall. "The song I was working through that night was Something." Nobody spoke. The shop held a silence the way old buildings hold cold, completely, and from every direction at once. Ray Caldwell stood behind his mahogany counter, in his 3-piece suit, beside his provenance documents and his authentication certificates, and his 18 years of professional certainty, and understood that he had spent nearly 2 decades buying and selling other people's emotion without ever once actually touching it. Near the door, a 19-year-old named Marcus Webb sat in the single customer chair with a battered notebook open in his lap, a pencil behind his ear, chord diagrams filling every margin. He had arrived 2 hours earlier and asked Ray for a job. Ray had told him without looking up that they weren't hiring. Marcus had not left. He had simply sat down and kept working, quiet and unobtrusive, taking up as little space as possible in a room that had made clear it was not built for him. George Harrison looked at this young man for a long moment. Then he looked at Claire. He said something in a low voice that Ray couldn't quite hear. Claire's eyes moved to Marcus, then to the framed page on the wall. What George Harrison said next, and what Claire did with it, didn't cost $35,000. It cost something Ray Caldwell had never once thought to put behind glass. Stay with this. You need to hear how it ends. Ray Caldwell came around from behind his counter for the first time since George Harrison had walked through his door. Not to guide anyone toward the exit, not to position himself between a customer and something expensive. He simply walked around to the front, stood on the same side of the counter as everyone else in the room, and said, in a voice stripped of every layer of professional polish he had spent 18 years applying, "I want to give you the piece. Please, no charge. Consider it returned to the man who created it. George shook his head once. You have rent to pay, Ray, and the piece has earned its place here. He looked at Claire and held out his hand. She understood immediately. She retrieved his card from the counter and processed the transaction without ceremony. $35,000. George Harrison did not discuss the price, did not negotiate, did not acknowledge it as a number worth remarking on. He simply waited. Then he walked to where Marcus Webb was sitting. Marcus looked up slowly, the way a person looks up when they are certain the attention is meant for someone else. George sat down in the empty chair beside him, not standing over him, not crouching to his level, but sitting, the way you sit next to someone you intend to speak to as an equal. He nodded at the notebook. May I? Marcus handed it over without a word. George opened it. He moved through the pages carefully, chord diagrams penciled in precise grids, half-finished progressions, fingering notations corrected and recorrected in the margins. The work of someone who was serious about the craft and had no one telling him that mattered. George studied the pages for a full minute. Then he uncapped the pen from his jacket pocket and wrote something on the inside front cover. He closed the notebook and handed it back. Marcus opened it. He read what was written there. He read it again. His hands had begun to shake, not from cold, not from nerves, but from being 19 years old and holding something that didn't feel proportionate to anything he had done to deserve it. He could not speak. He didn't try. George stood and walked back to Claire. He told her quietly that when the frame came down from the wall, it was not leaving the shop in his possession. It was going to Marcus Webb, not as charity, as an agreement. Marcus would work in the shop, learn the trade properly, and the page would remain with him for as long as he honored the work. A song isn't owned, George said. It's borrowed. You hold it for a while, and then you pass it forward. Ray Caldwell stood against his counter and watched all of it happen. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched a 30-year-old man in a worn corduroy jacket conduct the most valuable transaction that had ever taken place inside Meridian Records and produce no receipt, no provenance document, and no certificate of authentication. Before George Harrison walked out that door, he turned to Ray and said one sentence, just one. And Ray repeated it to every person who ever asked him why he changed. Don't move. Before he reached the door, George Harrison turned one last time and looked directly at Raymond Caldwell. He said 7 words. The signature was never the valuable part. Then he was gone. The door chime rang once behind him, thin and bright in the sudden quiet, and the shop settled back into itself. The cedar smell, the lit display cases, the framed posters behind glass, everything exactly where it had always been, and nothing in the room the same as it was an hour ago. Ray stood against his counter for a long time after that. He didn't reach for the ledger. He didn't check the afternoon appointment. He looked at the empty space on the back wall where the oak-framed page had hung for 2 years, authenticated, insured, temperature-controlled, and completely unrecognized for what it actually was. And he felt the specific weight of a man who has just been educated at enormous cost about something he should have understood from the beginning. Within 6 weeks, the mahogany counter was repositioned against the side wall. 3 chairs replaced it at the center of the shop floor. The invisible standard, the one built from tailored clothing and first impressions and the cold arithmetic of appearance, came down without ceremony and was never reconstructed. Ray did not announce the change. He simply made it. Regular customers noticed. New customers came. The composition of the room shifted, from wealthy collectors exclusively to collectors and students and working people who loved music and had previously understood that Meridian was not built for them. Every evening when Ray locked the front door, he would glance at the small hand-lettered card he had taped to the inside of the glass. It said, "Every collector started as someone who just loved the music." He had written it himself, the night after George Harrison walked out, before the silence had fully settled. Three things changed permanently after that October afternoon on West 48th Street. Raymond Caldwell never again positioned himself between a customer and something expensive based on what they were wearing. In 1977, a teenager named David arrived in a school uniform and asked to hold the shop's original pressing of Revolver. Ray pulled it from the case himself, set it on the counter, and let the boy stand there for 20 minutes, turning it over in his hands. The boy bought nothing. Ray told no one, and considered it one of the finest transactions of his career. Claire Donovan returned to music school the following spring. She graduated in 1976 and spent 30 years as a music educator in the Boston public school system. She kept her copy of All Things Must Pass until the day she died. The back cover photograph was worn soft at the corners from handling. Marcus Webb went on to produce records. He spent his career working specifically with young artists who had been told by someone in some room somewhere that they didn't belong there. He never spoke publicly about what George Harrison wrote on the inside cover of his notebook. Some things, he believed, were not meant to be performed. George Harrison never mentioned that afternoon in any interview. He gave hundreds of them over the remainder of his life. He talked about the Beatles, about India, about gardening at Friar Park. He never once mentioned Meridian Records or Raymond Caldwell. But the room remembered, and if you listened carefully enough to his music, really listened, you could hear exactly what he believed about who deserved to hold something beautiful. If this story moved you the way it moved everyone in that room that afternoon, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories like this one, because history remembers the famous names. We remember the moments that made them human.